On this episode of Supervision Simplified, we are talking about we are family. You know what that means.
I got all my systems with me.
Family systems theory. Don't miss it.
Hello there. I'm Dr. Amy Parks, and this is Supervision Simplified.
And I am Valarie Harris.
And we are excited to be here today to talk a little bit about family systems theory and supervision. And we know for a fact that if you don't remember a single thing about grad school family systems theory, you're going to totally remember one part of it because you're experiencing it probably on the regular. So when we get to that, I will point it out because you're going to go, oh my gosh, I completely forgot that. And yes, that's happening all the time. So we'll get to that in a little bit, but we're going to sort of integrate some of this idea around particularly Bowen's family systems theory and supervision. And we've talked before. One of our hot takes in a previous episode was talking about how we feel like lots of counselors, not so much MFTs or social workers, but lots of professional counselors have limited or maybe not as robust a background in family systems, and that we have seen that to be kind of problematic in our practices. What's going on in the family systems universe in your practice right now? And your supervision?
Well, in this episode, I promise not to step on anyone's toes.
Why do you promise that? That's no fun.
I will say that I guess there may be some LPC programs out there doing it better than others.
Good.
But I will say for me, it was a family class, and I know what's required by the board. So that's where I make that determination.
Right.
Is the board requires that you have a marriage and family counseling class. So I know based on that alone, unless you took an elective or unless you just were really interested in that class, that's probably all you got of it. You know what I mean? And so, but we talk a lot about it, but it's more so the elements of it. When thinking about like the biopsychosocial model and intersectionality, and then of course triangles. Triangles are huge for me. It's huge in trauma. It's huge in families. The reenactments, the bonds, the alliances that get formed. So that is, in our teaching way, like those are the things we're always looking at. It's definitely the triangle. Like there's a whole thing where I'm like, check the triangle. I even say it to my leadership, check the triangle with your direct report or a supervisor. Where are you are you a victim of your supervisee? I don't think so, but you might sound like one, so, and when you do that, you're cutting off your curiosity. So just things like that.
Yeah. So triangles are one that I'm going to mention when I talk about these 4 key tenets of family systems theory. And as we think about the relationship between a supervisor and a supervisee, how do we not only recognize that we are in somewhat of a family system dynamic, but also that we work within settings that are mirroring many of the individual components, the individuals that you're working with, they are mirroring their family systems. And so thinking about all of this and our work through a systems lens is just kind of a different way of considering. So fortunately for us today, I happen to have taught family systems just last night at the university. So I'm really excited to be able to be refreshed on my family systems theory. So when we talk about family systems, really the Bowen model, there are many of the Minuchin and some others, but the key one we're going to focus on is this Bowen idea. And really there are 4 key tenets. You've already mentioned one, and that's triangles. So triangles are the smallest stable relationship in a family system and consist of 3 people. There's a triangle, that's it. And when anxiety increases between 2 people, a third person is often drawn in to stabilize the relationship. So triangles can either alleviate or escalate tension. So as we're sort of naming these 4 things, let's think about how that might look in a supervisory relationship. Another of the 4 tenets is differentiation of self. And so this really, if you kind of think back on your learning, this refers to the ability of an individual to maintain their own sense of self while staying in an emotionally connected way to their family. So a well differentiated person can balance their own needs with those of the group without losing their individuality. And I find this differentiation of self come up often because I have a supervisee who often calls things Amyisms. And so like she does things and oh, that's an Amyism, or I learned that from you. And I think, okay, I want to make sure that you're using your own style and it's okay to reflect on mine. But, I watch that. The third tenet is nuclear family emotional system. So that this concept, and we can think about how this translates to supervision, but this concept really describes the patterns that are inherent in an emotionally functioning family, or the patterns of emotional functioning in a family, and that they commonly include things like marital conflict, dysfunction of one spouse, impairment of one or more children, and emotional distance. So those are sort of maybe the negative patterns of emotional functioning. And we can maybe look at some of those that are similar in supervision. And then finally, the family projection process. And this is the process by which parents or the leadership transmit their emotional problems to their children, and or in our scenario, to the people that they are working with and that are there in a leadership position or a position of power over. And this contributes to lower levels of differentiation in the subordinate, in the child, or in the supervisee, and perpetuates emotional dysfunction just across the whole relationship dynamic. So all that being said, let's start with your favorite. Let's start with triangles, and let's sort of talk about what that dynamic looks like in a supervisory relationship. How, supervisory relationships are usually just one supervisor and one supervisee. So where's the triangle coming from?
I think the triangle often comes in with the client,
Mm-hmm.
in whatever the client is bringing in. And then you have to consider a parallel process. So oftentimes what will happen is whatever triangle is being acted upon, or it is being, whatever triangle the client and the clinician are in, will often get replicated between the clinician and the supervisor, if you're
Okay.
not catching that.
Uh-huh.
And and it and
Talk
there's
more about
usually,
that. Do you have an example of that
yes.
without throwing
So,
anybody under the bus?
oh, totally. Yeah, it was a lot. So, for instance, I will have a supervisee who has what they consider to be a difficult client.
Okay.
And then what will happen is, because this client is coming in and basically projecting onto the clinician some sort of dysfunctional family pattern of engagement, or it could be that the clinician reminds them of their mom. And again, you got to remember, these are subconscious things, where language isn't, so it's not like someone is consciously doing this. It's subconscious. It is, projection in of itself is a defense mechanism. You know what I mean? So it is a way of coping. Although it's maladaptive, it was once adaptive. That's kind of how we see that. And so the clinician, when they don't remain in that place of curiosity or outside the triangle, it can then activate their stuff. So let's say this clinician is wanting to desperately help this person, and then they get into this giving solutions, or, well, let's try this, or let's do this, or let's do this. And this particular client, what I will see often is they don't want any part of it. They're fearful avoidant. So they're highly anxious and highly avoidant. So some would say that's disorganized. I feel like it does look a little different at times. So no matter what you do, this doesn't work. This isn't working. That's not going to work. When am I going to get better? I don't feel better. And so it frustrates the clinician, because the clinician is trying, and it's usually activating some of their stuff. So when I was treating clients like this, some of the times it would activate me, where I'm thinking, I'm giving you way more than I ever got. Like, and if you only knew, with me and my tinge of avoidance at times, how hard it is for me to even be in this space when you are just pressuring me for so much so fast. you would not ask so much. You know what I mean? So it's like two triangles colliding together.
Mm-hmm.
But then for the supervision side, what can happen if you don't catch it as a supervisor is then when I meet with that clinician embodies their client.
So
it's
become resistant.
Yes, it's I've tried this or I've tried that. That's not working. This client's not a good fit. I don't think this is my type of person. And I'm like, no, hold on. That's transference. Like, let's back up a minute. But then if I'm not careful, you can easily catch yourself trying to give them solutions. So you're trying to rescue your clinician because you see them frustrated and stuck and they're persecuting their client. And so then you're trying to like rescue the client. And then you might notice yourself trying to rescue the clinician. And then you're like, whoa, I'm in the triangle. I got to step out. And they're coming almost at you, persecuting you because after all, you gave me this client or I'm working with this client and you're not getting me to, and they don't know they're doing it. Again, this is not conscious. It is so nuanced that it's so subtle, but that's the parallel process. So whatever's happening here happens right over here.
And I love that we're talking about this because even though I work with families every day and I watch their systems, I have not been in a position of being skilled enough to translate this insight into my supervision on a regular basis. I am really very aware of parallel process and very aware of transference and countertransference, but I have not really considered the triangle piece of this. And I think this is so powerful because I can now think of like 5 or 6 scenarios. And before I was like, I don't think we've ever actually had that.
Oh no,
it does. It happens all the time. And I wonder, can a triangle happen with a non-present entity? For example, absolutely. Yeah. So, and that's projection, right? So like, or partly, I guess. So where you are working with a supervisee and they are seeing you as some kind of parent figure or something, or they're comparing you and or aligning you in some way in their mind, consciously, unconsciously, whatever, probably very unconsciously, with a parent figure or a former, leadership person in leadership position. How do you find, so without spending a million hours on triangulation, what do you find is the best strategy for helping your supervisors and supervisees get out of that?
So one thing that I like to do as a supervisor is you can do a genogram, but do it on authority in general with your supervisee, to see past authority figures, like, so that you're not really getting a whole lot into their personal stuff. So you have to really be careful because you don't want to be a therapist. But sort of to get an idea of, past leadership experiences, or especially because we employ veterans. And so that's a whole thing in of itself as well. And the way military units work. And so when you have several veterans, I feel like they get in a triangle. They don't even know it sometimes, or they kind of unit up, and it's not on purpose. It's a natural way of functioning that works for them. And so they tend to be the more protective ones in our practice. It's really interesting. But again, in supervision, even doing a genogram of sorts on just prior authority figures can give you an idea of whether or not they're going to be highly anxious around that, or if they had a good experience of that, or if they didn't, if they tend to be more people pleasy, or if they freeze, and you can construct it in a way of just helping them understand that you just want to be aware and that it's very nuanced and you want to be able to give them the best experience possible. And these are just things that we want to uncover sooner rather than later. I always like to try to predict what's going to happen so that when it happens, people don't freak out and think something's wrong. They're like, oh yeah, we talked about that. Mm-hmm. And so I like to do that with clients when you're going to trauma process, and then also clinicians, so that they don't feel like something's wrong with them and they have to hide the thing. In a group setting, sometimes what I will do is have them all close their eyes and imagine feeling victimized. Like, having somebody yell at them, scream at them, or whatever it is that would make them feel like a victim, and just notice like where they feel that in their body or how they notice it. Like, do they curl in? Like, what is their body doing? And then I will switch that into a persecutor role. Like, how would you feel if you just really want to go after somebody? Like, they have just upset you. You feel like things are not just and you want to fight, and have them kind of embody that. And then do the same thing with the rescuer role. Like, what is, so that they can identify in their body, and that comes from Janina Fisher's work, so that they can identify in their bodies where they're going to feel that and how they're going to notice it. So trying to help them get better at noticing it quicker so that they can catch it.
Yeah, I love the idea of really encouraging an ability to notice when it's happening, because I don't actually think of a situation where it's probably not happening. It's probably happening everywhere all the time. And the same with another one of the Bowen family systems tenets, which is this family projection process, where, in relationship with your supervisee and or your supervisee back to you, that there's this projection sort of experience where emotional problems and or concerns are being projected, maybe not openly stated by any stretch, but, being projected out. And this contributes to really, your supervisee not having the skills to be able to differentiate themselves in a way that is healthy.
Yes, absolutely. Sometimes that happens. I'll notice if a situation is similar to one of their family of origin, then it's very easy for them to project and make assumptions about the other people in that client's life. And so if a client is presenting and feeling like they are, suffering from emotional or verbal abuse, or have just, then it can be very quick for a clinician to just automatically assume that person they're with is a narcissist. And I'm like, whoa, 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 like, whoa,
Right.
no,
Right.
stop. We can't do that. And it's, they don't in the moment always catch it. They're just they identify with that pain source,
Right.
and it may not even be their storyline, but they just identify so well with that pain that all of a sudden the other person in that relationship is the bad guy or the bad person. And since we have co-treating teams, this can get triangles on triangles in all kinds of complexity. We can have a therapist treating a couple, and then a therapist treating the husband and another treating the wife. And they are all going to have a very varied idea of what's happening.
Yeah.
And that can shift. And then, so you really in that moment have 6, 7, you have 8 triangles in essence, because each clinician has a triangle. They have a triangle with the client, or the clients have a triangle. Like, it's a lot.
Yeah.
And so really looking at where all of that is intersecting, and remaining in that place of neutrality, and catching when you're out of it, and catching when you're making assumptions. And, I've had to challenge some supervisees about that often and say, when you do that, when you're rushing into that, I know that people with borderline traits give a certain air and a feel, but so do people with complex trauma. And in self-report alone, without assessment, without knowing the family system, you just cannot make that determination.
That's
and
just
do it
guessing. Right.
So you're going to cut off your ability to be curious.
Yeah. I think it's interesting too. I think that as much as this theory and the system speaks to, negative emotions being projected onto, another individual or a person in leadership or authority, I think the opposite can be true too, where, especially in a leadership relationship, where you might get a supervisee who is coming in with their own trauma or their own, they have their own triangles and their own experience, and they see you as a healthy, sort of functioning member of the team or the family, the group or whatever, the system. And so then they lose their differentiation because they align so closely with you, because you are so much safer or perceived as so much safer than their family of origin or their experience, past experience. So that's where, again, I love the idea of like an authority genogram to talk about, what has been your past relationship with authority, maybe not even naming specific people, but, patterns of authoritative or authoritarian behaviors in past, just represented by, neutral objects.
Yes.
I think that's really cool. So then we think of the differentiation of self part. How do we then, knowing we've kind of looked at and we're bringing an awareness of triangles and how they feel in the body, bringing an awareness of this projection process and talking and naming it so that we can, tame it in supervision to some extent. How do we look at this differentiation of self part and we think about this ability to maintain a sense of self and stay also emotionally connected to the system?
Yeah. So I find that to be a little bit interesting in different ways. So like in substance abuse, for instance, you might have an addict who otherwise may be known as a scapegoat. And so, they are holding I always say they're usually the truth teller in the family system also. But then imagine they go to treatment, they come back, and there's a different type of differentiation, right? And as a result of their differentiation, but the members of that family system have not yet differentiated from the role that they've always played. Now it challenges the ability to stay emotionally connected. And Gabor Mate says, if attachment is a threat, then authenticity will go every single time. I tend to be somebody which I like to argue with him anyway sometimes, but I am so committed to authenticity that I'll almost let attachments cut before I'll let authenticity go. But I think that's because it's attachment to self that I value over everything else. Mm-hmm. And so I think, we see this a lot with teenagers, obviously. We see it a lot even in, I think, as clinicians, being able to differentiate yourself and your story from your client's story, even when they're similar. Mm-hmm. So one of the things, I think that's important is being able to state the thing. So for instance, we've had a clinician that had a pretty specific situation happen. And it was known it was known to the public in some different ways. It was something that was personally like a personal loss. And that turned into some advocacy work and things of that nature. So we've had a client or clients seek to work with that clinician, and we don't want to make the assumption that that person knows what happened, although their story is very similar. And yet we want to make sure that the clinician is able to differentiate mm-hmm. and still work with that client. But then you don't want to assume the client doesn't know, you know what I mean? So it's right. Working then with that clinician to say, do you feel you can differentiate? Are you in a space that you can do that? Because you don't have, if you can't, we understand. Mm-hmm. And if you're going to be able to differentiate, you feel that you can, it feels necessary to potentially, like in that moment, to let the client know about the similarities in that situation. Mm-hmm. Because in that way, you're almost honoring your differentiation too. You're stating this is similar. Mm-hmm. And I come from this lens because this is personally close to me. However, my experience is still different. And at any point, if you feel as though what I've gone through is blending with your, you know what I mean? Like, it's just, you have a candid conversation about how that could get complex and confuse or blur that differentiation. But you also still want to just honor it and bring it in the room because it's already there.
Right. Exactly. I while you were talking, I was also thinking about, as a leader, one of the things that as we become more skilled in our leadership roles, we often see those people who we are leading or who work with us or have worked with us for a while have a lot of difficulty differentiating, or not differentiating, but a lot of difficulty seeing the new sort of growth of the leader, or if a leader in your practice or
Yes.
someone takes on a new role. So you move
Yes.
from non-supervisor licensed into supervisor. That's a
Yes.
big systems change and an interesting challenge. And I wonder how we can help. I don't actually have the answer to this. Maybe you have the answer to this, but I wonder how we can help our professional colleagues in this collective of supervisors think about how to ritualize to some extent, maybe, and or empower that new role so it becomes a little easier for everyone to get. And be able to work on. You know what I'm asking? Does that make sense?
Yes, I think it's really important to over communicate about the dualities of them, and also the ways in which they do differentiate. I think that obviously people need to hear something several times to create clarity, and so being that I carry a lot of hats, being the lead clinical supervisor, clinical director, and the owner and employer, and we have other supervisors, and we have an assistant clinical director, but even very few of us sit in just one seat. So even a clinician has the role of a clinician, but also has the role of a supervisee.
Right.
And
Or colleague.
and also has the role of a colleague.
Right.
And so there are times where I may be talking with someone who is a supervisee, and I'm talking as a colleague, not as the supervisor.
Yeah, that's tough.
And so other times, maybe there's a candid conversation that has to happen between myself and a supervisee for me as the employer. And so in those moments, I just think it's really important to constantly clear that line and constantly state the intention and state the frame that you're coming from. And there are times, even with a supervisee or even with an employee, that I have said, this is Valarie, the person, or Valarie, the woman, or Valarie, the mom. And, I just wanted to check on this.
I find myself saying that in session some. I don't think I say it as often in supervisory or leadership roles. Like, I want to say this from a different kind of perspective, but all of these things, differentiation of self, awareness of triangles, bringing it to the fore, you're noticing, understanding the projection process and how it's similar to countertransference and transference and that whole parallel process of that building. All of that creates what is the fourth sort of part of this family systems theory, which is creating, an emotionally safe system. And so whether you are in an agency and, a large agency or a large practice or a small practice or a university, there's no denying that there's a system there. And you have a role as a supervisor in creating the felt safety of the individuals that are there. And I was just talking with a colleague earlier today, and we were talking about, what is the small thing that we can do right now? Because there are a lot of things that are happening in our world that we feel like we have no control over. And so what are the small things that we can do to create safety? And so this sort of same thing came up, which was work on our own differentiation, work on our own sense of felt safety, and have an awareness of these kinds of things. So I'm wondering, what are some strategies that we could also consider for creating safe environments for people to feel seen and people to become more emotionally healthy and healed, and be able to do the same work with others?
I think, from my perspective, I really believe, in the whole leaders go first type of mentality, that we model that. So, what that looks like, and historically, I didn't always do that, and it didn't go well. When I was a new leader and I didn't understand leadership and had not read 550 books about it and had coaching and all the other things, I felt like the role of a leader meant that I always had to have it together at all times. And that's
That's what makes
simply
me
not,
laugh thinking about that.
that's simply not true. Now I don't get to tap out as the leader. I
Right.
have to show up. That's what that was the truth. The truth is you don't have a choice not to show up sometimes. Like you got to do it. But it if I wanted my staff or supervisees to know that it's okay to not be okay, and that it is never okay to not be okay and act okay, then I can't do that because they're going to sense it. And then that will disrupt trust and safety immediately because
Mm-hmm.
it will be here's this person who is saying these things, but those actions, her actions don't align with the words. And then that incongruence disrupts safety and trust.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. That's so interesting. And, I mean, we both adhere to the clear is kind philosophy of safety as well. So, that brings up what you said earlier about really bringing clarity to the relationship and being very clear about here are the boundaries. Here is what I am potentially coming with in this scenario. And so I guess I wonder if that leads back to some, orientation conversations in supervision. I mean, obviously they're going to be ongoing, but in
Mm-hmm.
I know so many supervisors, and I know when I first started supervising too, I would do this as well, is just kind of like launch into the work of
Oh
like
yeah,
what needs to be accomplished and discussed and then like move on. But
yeah,
I'm really am incredibly like committed to the idea of orienting your supervisees to how things, not the what, but how this is going to go.
yes.
And being
I
really
need to do
intentional.
that better. I do it better with interns, but where I drop the ball and where I'd like to really do a much better job and focus on is the orientation from intern to master's level. Like I am starting to do that, so I think that helps. But then also master's level to provisionally licensed.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then I did do some orienting from someone who is done with supervision, so um, kind of orienting like what does that look like after the fact, like that we don't meet on a regular basis for supervision, but I didn't do it with all of them, you know what I mean? And so I love that point because that is something that um, I certainly can then just make assumptions about that they know what that looks like or what that means or what resources we have. And while nothing has gone sideways from not orienting, I think from a place of safety and trust, it would just provide more empowerment and more clarity, and really launch them to that next level
Yeah.
with a better start.
I can confidently say from experience that the difference between moving from internship, so like a master's level intern that's finishing up their program, into licensure, when you do not have a reorientation
Mm-hmm.
conversation, it is not typically a very successful transition, and it can be a bumpy road. That does
Mm-hmm.
not mean it's permanently a bumpy road all the time, but sometimes it can be. Sometimes it can be a crash and burn.
Yeah.
And I have seen that happen in my own work. I haven't done that. I haven't done the orientation, and it screwed me over. And it screwed over the clinician, like, and the same is true when someone moved from resident, or provisionally licensed to licensed. Same
Yeah.
conversation, same,
Totally.
same intentional conversation, not same content, but same how this is how things are going to be. And I never, it's only been in the last maybe 4 years, maybe even 3 years, that I've become super, super intentional about saying, this is how this is going to look now. And people
Mm-hmm.
think it's weird when I do it. They're
Yeah.
like, sure, sure. Like we know that. And I'm like, no, actually, you didn't really know that. You thought you knew it. I need to be clearer as to I need to be confident that you have heard me say this is going to be the way it is. And I'm seeing this too with some leaders that I'm familiar with and that work with, I mentor and stuff. And I see the same thing there, that we have to practice the how from the very beginning. We have to have those how conversations, because otherwise you're setting up a system on sand.
Yes. Yes.
So
Or a dependent culture.
yes.
Um,
Yeah,
by
a dependent culture. That's exactly it. Where
Mhm.
it's like, why don't they understand that this is, why aren't they doing this thing? Or why
Or
don't
why
they
does it
know how to
function
look up
differently when
this
I'm
policy?
in the state than when I'm out of the state? Even if I'm not in the office, why does it function differently when I'm here versus when I'm not?
Right, right. Or
What is systematically something is shifting?
right. Why would you have a different ethical responsibility as a resident than you would as an intern? Like
Right.
why do you think that the job has changed? Why do you think that I am responsible for holding your hand at this stage of your development?
Right.
So I think all of those things are really interesting, and they certainly parallel parenting in so many ways. And yet you don't have to be a parent to know how to be a leader. You don't have to be a leader to be a parent, but they certainly do go quite hand in hand. And it's really interesting to see how
That
those
is
things.
true. And when we don't do that in our practice, we're probably not teaching our clients to do that either.
Right.
And I think of even an orientation process around boundaries and, shifts in life. You know what I mean? So, probably when I separated from my spouse and got a divorce, I feel like I probably should have provided an orientation period to my entire family system, of some sort of like, hey, this is what life's going to look like for me for a minute,
I actually
and
think that's a great idea.
yeah. And because they have their own felt sense of things and they're going through their own process. The kids go through their own process. Like everyone has their own process. And yet if you're the one that's been over functioning from an emotional standpoint and all of a sudden you're pulling back and getting balanced and you're not filling that space, it leaves the system a little wobbly.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, it kind of back to the idea of leadership and being a supervisor, really the sort of summation of this conversation regarding this system model and supervision is that you really can't get away from the idea that this is a system. And whether you
Mm-hmm.
adhere to a model such as this or not, there are clearly some positive takeaways that can really impact your work. Being really clear about triangles and how they might feel and how you will notice them. Really being mindful about what may be being projected one way or the other with the person that you work with, the person that you're supervising, and or your colleagues in whatever leadership relationship you might have. Thinking about how you are differentiating yourself in situations, and also being very observant around how your supervisee is considering their own self differentiation and individuation is another part of that. And then, finally thinking about this idea of really orienting to the process to build an emotional sense of safety for the
Mm-hmm.
whole collective system. And then, finally, this isn't really part of the package here, but really being aware enough to constantly be assessing that,
Yes.
because it just can't be once that you pay attention. It has to be on the regular.
Yeah, because we're all part of systems that are
Yeah.
outside the system
Right.
that we're monitoring, and the outside systems affect the system in front of us.
And
Like
the one thing
they're
that we know
so
is inherently true about any relationship is that it is in a constant state of change. And
Mhm.
that's a wonderful, beautiful thing, and a thing to be incredibly intentional and mindful around. So I think that those are really key. Thanks for all these great things in this conversation. I know you are super into this idea, and I know you were an expert on the triangles, so that was
Yes.
particularly helpful. And hopefully, people thought, "Oh yeah, I know about triangles, and I never even thought about them in the supervisory process." Anything else you want to say before we wrap up today, Valarie?
No, I really appreciate your insight on some of the other parts of the family systems theory model. And I think I guess the final thing I would just say is, you don't have to work from a family systems perspective, but you do have a responsibility to kind of work from a family systems perspective if you're a leader, because you're in it whether you want to be or not.
Yep.
Your team is in it, your supervisees are in it. And so whether or not you work with it with clients really doesn't matter. It will affect the dynamics in your practice and in the clinical work. So it's always good to know it.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for this conversation today. And thanks to all of you for tuning into Supervision Simplified. The revolution starts with you. And don't forget to subscribe and particularly to share this with someone that you might be thinking about that would really, really appreciate this conversation. We're eager for your comments, stories, and feedback to ensure we're hitting just the right topics that you care about. Keep simplifying and elevating your supervision game. Until our next episode. Bye.
Bye.